Hello, my name is Sandra Shattuck and welcome to the community of writers. Today my guest is Patricia Preciado-Martin. She is a highly beloved Tucsonense because of her oral histories. She's a writer of fiction. We'll be focusing on her short stories today. And she is a speaker, and I'm honored that she's able to join us today.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Sandra.
Thank you. If you want to know more about her life, you can check out a podcast on Tucsonense. Angus Anderson published it on October 30th, 2016, and it was based on 3 hours of interview in early 2016, I think. And one of the things that I noticed was you were talking about studying in Mexico after you finished at the university, that you knew you were Mexicana, but in Mexico you understood that you were intellectually and historically Mexican. And it reminded me of Amor Perdido, Lost Love, in your latest collection, Amor Eterno. And there are really two lost loves in this story, but one of the lost loves is Mexico. So the narrator is an older man, Francisco, who remembers going to Mexico when he's a very young child, and it's when he hits the mountains and looks at it. It's a gorgeous passage. So I was wondering if you would be willing to read that passage for us.
Well, this passage comes right out of my heart because this is how I saw real Mexico for the first time, and began to have a broad appreciation and love culture, history, traditions of Mexico. But then, when the engine began its gargantuan effort to climb, traverse, and then descend the enormous spine of the Sierra Madre Oriental, he began to kneel upright for a better view out the window, and to stare and exclaim with excitement. He had never seen mountains so high, mysterious and blue, cloud-crowned at their summits like ancient gods. The valleys so deep and green, tattooed with the intricate terraces of maguey and maize. Unexpected cataracts of crystalline waters tumbling down into secretive gorges. Deep and winding rivers, both languid and roaring. Bright flashes of brilliant birds embroidering the texture of the trees with their flight and song. Cascading flowers of every hue adorning the branches of the vines and trees. The San Miguelito, the bougainvillea, the jacaranda, and the flamboyant, red like the color of his own pounding heart. He saw mustangs running free in pastures of saffron flowers. The mile after mile of stone corrals that embraced the land seemed to emerge from the earth without the intervention of man. Fields breathed long plumes of misty sighs in the clear, cool morning. Tile-roofed hamlets exhaled a rosy haze with the setting sun. La Tierra Mexicana was alive.
Thank you.
Okay.
I love that last line, and I don't think it's a sense of nostalgia. I don't always see nostalgia as a helpful emotion, but when you say La Tierra Mexicana was alive, what did that mean for that character and also for you, given your study in Mexico?
Well, for this particular character who came from Chicago, it's actually based on a friend that I met a number of years ago whose parents had immigrated from Mexico, his father and his grandfather, to work in the steel mills in Chicago. And he told me this story about how an uncle of his had gone back to visit Mexico. And it just inspired me because I think those of us who were born in the United States and sometimes don't get those opportunities to travel and in Mexico and learn about our country, that this comes as a real epiphany, how beautiful it is, how rich it is. We are born and raised here in maybe barrios or like my friend Frank in the barrios of Chicago, and we don't really realize what our heritage is, and that's what that was based on. My own personal memories, and also how it could have affected someone whom I fictionalized going down to Mexico for the first time.
Yeah, wonderful. So maybe to tie on to that, I was listening carefully to your notes about language in that interview. And you talk about being born in Prescott, moving to Tucson at age 3, but not considering yourself bilingual, that your grandmother didn't speak English, but you studied the language in the university, and then you studied in Mexico and lived with a family. So maybe if you would talk about language, my note to myself here is that when writers use another language within their work, there's usually, to me, it seems like 3 choices. Either you translate with footnotes, or you translate within the context of the piece, or you just don't translate. So would you talk about your choices, your linguistic choices in this collection of stories, and how you use Spanglish, or gringañol, as some people call it?
Okay, that's a new one. I like that word. Well, you know, it's interesting because my father actually wanted us to learn Spanish, but he had suffered because he did not know English when he was first in school. And so he insisted that we learn English and learn it well. But he also, every once in a while, would say only Spanish in the house. So we did get Spanish at home. I can't say that I spoke it except when I visited with my grandmother, but I had the ear. By the time I went to school, I already had it engraved. It was in part of my consciousness. And I became completely bilingual, I would say, you know, not like a native speaker, of course, from Mexico. When I went to study in Mexico, and I've traveled a lot in Mexico. But the interesting thing about that is, working in the community too, I learned a lot of the slang and just sayings from my own parents, you know, dichos, and the exchanges that they made together in Spanish, the songs that people would sing. So all of this was being ingrained in me. It's interesting what you said about the translating, because that wasn't my choice. It was the press's choice. Now, there was a point at which I wanted things translated because I get annoyed when I read books and they don't translate the French, or, you know, and I don't know what the word means, and I don't speak French. But I think their philosophy changes or is adaptable, because I think they think that translating in the middle of the manuscript or the middle of the prose is distracting, and it kind of gets people off the subject. Translating at the footnote isn't that handy either. It's kind of, again, you're doing this switching, this code switching. So I think that's why it sometimes is uneven. Sometimes it's translated, and sometimes it isn't. And that was up to the press, actually. It was an editorial decision.
Okay.
So.
Okay. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Your stories are so grounded in setting and time. So, and especially in this collection, one of the things I love about this collection is how radically different the stories are, the characters, the setting. So you range from the first one, which is set in the 1800s in Mexico, to set in the 1950s, and different characters. So one of my questions was, what sort of research do you do in order to get the dialogue? Because when you've got a young girl in the 50s and she's using all the slang from Southern California, I mean, you've got all of that time-specific language. So what kind of research do you do when you write these stories?
Well, you know, that's interesting. I don't do a lot of research, except for maybe some of the slang, but some of the slang I knew already, because it's just I think it's my life experience. And having done oral history, I have met tons of people, many people in the community. And you have to remember, the first oral history I did was in 1978. And then, I mean, that was 40 years ago. And then as I progressed during oral history, I exposed myself to a lot of people in the community. And if I wanted to find out about a word, for example, mostly the Pachuco slang I was not very familiar with. I knew a few words. I would just ask some of my friends who were from that era, which was before my time. And so, it's, you know, the the stories really come out of my personal experience, and they're not really folkloric in that sense any more than another author who just gets inspired. It's like, someone would plant a seed. They'd say just one thing, one sentence, and a story would grow out of that. I don't consider that necessarily folkloric, but so all of the stories I can say, every single story I've ever written that's fiction, has been from a personal experience, just maybe a short little saying that someone said, or a short story that they told me of their life, and the story would grow out of that. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of authors can relate to that. That's our source of inspiration for me, has been the community.
Right. And family. I was just thinking about your grandmother, the toreadora,
Yes,
getting the chicken, which just shows your humor, too.
That's based on a true story. Of course, literary license, I elaborated on
but
it.
It's so wonderful. I can just see her.
And yes, and it did happen the way I said, except, the whole story of the bukis and the kids and that's part of my literary license and my creativity. Mm-hmm. But my grandmother did kill the chicken, and she would put it under the tin, but the story evolved from that. And a man told me a story once. He's in one of my oral history books about how he had helped his father make adobes for their house, and he said, if you knock down the walls of that house, you'll see my footprints. Well, a story grew out of that, Earth to Earth. Yes, and I like that story because, and I hope I'm not talking too much, but people say, well, your stories are not political. Well, of course they're political. They're very political. And, they might not be the same approach to politics as other people, but I'm just amazed that stories that I wrote 25 years ago are still relevant today as far as politics are concerned. So I just wanted to share the beauty of my culture and the humor and the pathos and the sorrow and the love and the happiness and the family values. And all of that to me is indirectly political because it shows people who we are, who we really are, I hope, and that maybe when people know who we are, then they'll love us.
Absolutely.
And respect us,
Absolutely.
So anyway, all those stories really happen.
Yes,
So.
That's fantastic. I think we're almost out of time, but I have about 12 other questions for you at least. We're going to have to do this like another time.
Oh dear, sorry.
Songs, maybe if you can get this in, I'll tell you when we don't have any more time, but why do you have songs in here? Why almost every story has a song that begins the story?
Well, because for Mexican people, there's nothing quite like a love song, and and mariachis and my grandparents' generation are sang the songs my parents sang, and I can go to Jim Griffiths for his annual party, and we're all sitting around with Bobby Benton, and he's playing these old songs. It's so much part of our of who we are. It's because they run the range of emotions. Love and loss and tragedy and everything that you can think of, like one of the mariachis said, all the mariachis are about women and horses, and our lost rancho, and they all have that connection emotionally for all of us, and I'm glad they're still part of us,
Yes.
I don't know about the new generation, maybe so. The younger generation, maybe so. But I know certainly with mine and the generation following mine, these songs are still very popular.
Excellent.
So
that's wonderful.
Classic is a classic.
Okay. So that's all the time that we have today, unfortunately. Thank you for joining us on the Community of Writers, and thank you so much, Patricia. This was wonderful.
Well, thank you. My goodness, I'm very honored.
Yeah, we'll see you next time. Hello, my name is Sandra Shattuck, and welcome to the Community of Writers. Today my guest is Patricia Preciado-Martin, who is a beloved Tucsonense because of her oral histories, because of her fiction, and because of her speaking, and I think she's also an educator. This is part 2 of our interview, and we're talking mostly about fiction and mostly about her latest collection, Amor Eterno, 11 Lessons in Love. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, Sandra.
So I talked to my students who will be beginning to read Amor Eterno next week. I've taught the book now twice, and I told them a little bit about the book, and asked them if they had any questions. And Jasmine Castillo asked, why are all the stories about love?
Good question. I actually, I decided because of my age, and this was done, 20 years ago, almost 18 years ago. I can't believe that. But anyway, the contemporary Mexicana Chicana writers tell a different story. I mean, it's contemporary. It's modern. It has to do more with contemporary values and women's liberation, just as it should be. But I decided that I couldn't relate to those stories, because in my own case and in my sister's case, I have to limit my experience because, I know girls will be girls and boys will be boys, even in the 50s. But in some ways, in my small world, we were very innocent. We went to Catholic schools, the nuns were very strict. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, I decided I wanted to write love stories about different kinds of love. Love that didn't have to be about sex. And if it's okay to say this, they can edit it out. I always say, if you're expecting any genitalia in this book, you're not going to find it.
It's true. There is no genitalia.
These are love stories of the past and of innocence. And so I set out to do it. And they're all based, some of them on my grandparents, where the story is about where my grandfather had to ask permission of my grandmother's parents to marry her, and apparently he was turned down several times, and for good reason. But anyway, finally they relented, and I'm not sure why. That's a whole other story. And the story of my own parents, but of course everything is elaborated on. There's the idea. It's like Alfredo Villa says, the flesh is fiction, but the bones are real. And that is
lovely.
True about my books. The bones are real, but the flesh is fiction, because we have to build on our own life experience, or on little stories people tell us. So,
Oh, I love that quote.
isn't that wonderful?
It's wonderful.
Had
It
you
really
heard that
is.
before?
No.
I'll never forget it. Sometimes I forget it when I want to repeat it, but tonight I remember what he said.
I was going to
Yeah.
write it down, but I'm going to watch the interview later and take
Okay,
notes.
okay.
So, because I want to remember that one. It's it's wonderful.
Yeah, it is.
So I think I'll do another student question. Sort of a funny one.
That's
But
okay.
if
I
you're
love 'em.
if you're from Tucson, you're going to get this question. David Ortega asks, "Where'd you go to high school?"
I went to Salt Point.
Okay.
I told you about the religious part and the nuns, and we had to wear our skirts way down past our knee, and we weren't allowed to wear patent leather shoes because it reflected up our skirts. Now you will understand this book. This is what I had to go through growing up. Anyway, yes, we had to go to mass. We had,
But it still feels so contemporary because of the way you draw the characters. I mean, I can relate to the girls in the 1950s and,
Well, great.
even in the 1800s. I mean, it's all completely so present in many ways. Oh, I have so much that I want to do. So let me,
Okay.
the present and past, I have something I want to read here, but let me do, Jessica Valencia asks, what inspires you to write? What inspires your stories?
Well, I have to say, I get emotional about this. It's mi gente, my community, la comunidad, mi gente, mi familia. my family, all these stories spring from them. And without them, I would not be a storyteller. So, you know, I've been thinking about the new stories I'm writing, and it's true. Every single one of them is based in an experience that I had. So I don't think I would be here. I don't know. There are some writers that just grab things out of the firmament, but I've never been like that. So that's what I have to say, is that it's who I am, and that's why it comes from my heart. I love my culture. I love Mexico, and the good and the bad, and I'm proud of who I am. I'm a Chicana, Mexicana, Hispana, Mexico-Americana. I'm all of those, and that's where the stories come from.
Wonderful. So that relationship with the past and the present reminds me of your first book, Days of Plenty, Days of Want. You have a more recent edition. But Carmen Tafoya has an introduction, and I like her first paragraph. In the writings of Patricia Preciado-Martin, one hears the clear voice of heritage. That's what you just said. This is not a heritage that comes as an artifact, disinterred and rediscovered, but rather it is an intimate treasure mirrored, generation upon generation, and passed spirit to spirit in an undying breath of life. As the reader moves through her stories, there is at once a sense of timelessness and absolute rootedness. Love that. The stories move from the past to the present and back to the past with no change of tone or clarity. To Preciado-Martin, the past is every bit as real as the present and every bit as pervasive and all-encompassing. So would you say that accurately describes?
Gee, thanks, Carmen.
I know, it's beautiful.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish I should. I've got to read my books again. You know, it's been a while. But yeah, I remember actually meeting her, and I guess, you know, I would like to not be so rooted in the past that it's nostalgic or maudlin. But we are who we are because of our past, and it all adds up eventually, and it's how we interpret it and use it to enhance ourselves as a people. I think, you know, people who are proud of their heritage like you are of yours, I think it enhances them. It's a soul thing, and it has been for me all these years. You know, I feel very fortunate that I slowly discovered this.
Yes.
And discovered how much I love it.
Wonderful. Well, I know we talked a little bit about some critics naming you as a folklorist, which I think is a fantastic, I mean, folklore is a field, right? Anthropology of folklore, and a researcher. They focus more on your oral histories and don't pay as much attention to your fiction. And the idea is that somehow the fiction is maybe, you know, not up to snuff because you are a folklorist and an oral historian. And so I was wondering if you could comment about that. Maybe we could take it somewhere else completely, and maybe talk about the relationship between your oral histories and the fiction and how they feed each other. Maybe that's an even more interesting question.
Well, you know, I think that the oral histories are kind of separate, and they are separate. And it's interesting because I have thought about this myself, and whether or not I've intellectualized it or not, I don't know. I don't call myself a folklorist. I interview people and write down their memories. I mean, I'm not an academic. I've never claimed to be an academic. I just tell the stories. I tell stories. I'm a storyteller, whether it's from oral histories or from my own imagination based on oral histories. But one thing I did notice that you might find interesting, and it was self-discovery. I wrote Images and Conversations, and the next book I wrote was Days of Plenty. I wrote Songs My Mother Sang to Me, and the next book I wrote was El Milagro, and other stories.
So nonfiction, fiction,
Nonfiction, fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And it just one seemed to naturally follow the other.
I love that.
So,
I love that.
And it was not a conscious thing. It's just that I think talking to people inspired me. Remember, there were a lot of stories that I didn't put in my oral histories because in the oral histories, I needed to have a beginning, middle, and end. I had to tell a complete story from beginning to end of this person.
Yeah.
And then, so there were other people that I talked to that would tell me interesting things, like Amparito Carrillo, who wore her children's teeth on a ring that she had made specially. Just little quirky things that I would learn, and I'd file them away. So I wasn't conscious about it until later, and I realized that my process was this. So anyway, I think it's difficult to give people certain titles and to box them in.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel comfortable being called a folklorist, but I feel comfortable be called a storyteller and an oral historian, which is different, I think.
So, storyteller extraordinaire, we are out of time, and thank you so much for joining us on the Community of Writers, and I want to thank especially Patricia Preciado-Martin for coming and sharing her wisdom and experience and artistry with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandra.